Now, this is an interesting video for me to be looking at. It really is an interesting video for me to be looking at because, well, as videos go, and topics go, it's Admiral Fisher and Admiral Henderson, that's Reginald Henderson's, R.G.H. Henderson, job swatch. How does each do as a third Sea Lord in the other's place? And, well, this has been proposed a few times in various ways, and it's always comes up as rather interesting. Comes up as rather interesting because, ultimately, whilst one is a quiet political operator, and probably very successful for his time period because he's a quiet political operator, the other one's a loud political operator, and quite successful in his time because he is. Both have visions of the future of naval warfare and what they need to do to make the Navy ready for it, and both are largely successful in doing their preparations. So it's kind of interesting. Henderson, of course, historically dies in 1939, so he doesn't get to go on to higher rank, but Fisher, Jackie Fisher, carries on and becomes First Sea Lord. So it's really rather interesting if you do a job swap on them, how things could work out. Now, as always the case with alternate histories, as I always prefer to do with alternate histories, we're going to look at the history, their actual positions and times, and what they were up to, till we get to the Shameless book plug, and then we're going to convert and twist them round, and see what might happen. And again, it is rather interesting to work out, because one of the criteria that's not put in this is they don't retain their knowledge when they make their travel. So the assumption I'm making is they do retain their knowledge. Now that's really interesting for Henderson coming back. That is really interesting for Henderson coming back. A man who's been involved in as many interesting things as he is coming back. But it's also kind of interesting with Fisher going forward. Now, the office of the Third Sea Lord and Controller, and I've done some videos discussing this before, is a very, very powerful position. It combined two posts: the Third Sea Lord, the office of the Third Sea Lord, which was the naval personnel who was supposed to be in charge of basically procurement, and the office of the Controller, or the Clarke Controller of the Navy, who was basically in charge of the bureaucracy and research and development of the Navy. And when you put those two positions together, you end up with someone who is... how do I put this politely? Well, I'm going to do it by actually reading off that list, because that list kind of matters. Responsible for superintending the work of the Royal Naval Scientific Service, the Department of Director of Naval Construction, the Department of the Engineer-in-Chief, originally the Steam Department, of course, Department of Director of Naval Ordnance, Department of Director of Dockyards. And these are just the core departments that the Third Sea Lord is in charge of. And theoretically has a full vote on the board, which is always nice, of the Admiralty, and has the right to attend the board whenever the works of the department are coming up or something of general service nature has to be discussed. If you consider the full swing which is under the Third Sea Lord's auspices, there is never a meeting where the Third Sea Lord is not needed to be there. You need to have ships available for an event. You'd better have the Third Sea Lord there, because you're going to need to know if the dockyards are going to be able to do it, and the ordnances are going to be able to be supplied, and all the engineering is up to standard. Want to talk about future ship designs? Oh, that's the office of the Third Sea Lord. Want to talk about foreign ship designs? That's the office of the Third Sea Lord. You want to talk about naval scientific development for communications and range finding? Oh, that's the office of the Third Sea Lord. At various points, sections of the hydrography department end up under the Third Sea Lord. Basically, at certain points in its history of the Admiralty, we talk about the Admiralty not having a staff. Basically, they do have a staff. It's either all the staff report to the Third Sea Lord, or they're the Naval Intelligence Division. Those are your two branches of staff. And pretty much, this is why, at certain points in history, Third Sea Lords can be more powerful than First Sea Lords. The First Sea Lord's the head of the service. That's true. And the Second Sea Lord runs the people and is in charge of procurement and personnel. So, one looks after the body, the body in terms of the manpower, and all the crew, and one is telling everyone where to go. But the Third Sea Lord is the neck, the skeleton, all the organs which make the whole body work. Everything. So basically, when the Third Sea Lord really doesn't want something to happen, it doesn't happen. This is why when we talk about things like Chatfield making an agreement with Henderson, and the agreement, broadly speaking, is Chatfield gets to push through the King George V with 14-inch guns. In return, Chatfield basically turns around to Henderson and goes, "Mea culpa, you're in charge of everything else, and I will not argue with your procurement at all." This is why when Chatfield puts forward a point of going, "Are you sure you need to build large destroyers? They might need more crew, and we can't afford all these crew." And Henderson's response was a very interesting quip, which basically went along the lines of, it had a whole reason for why to build these larger ships, da-da-da-da-da. And then at the bottom, underneath his signature, was a typed PS. PS, the larger designs require less crew. Comes out in a minute. He explains it to Chatfield. If it's a slightly larger hull, you have more space for maintenance. That's easier to do maintenance. So instead of you needing to have crew crawling into very difficult positions, tiring themselves out and taking longer to do maintenance, they can do the maintenance more easily from more accessible positions, which means you need less engineers to keep the engines at the same high level of spec. Amazing, really. He put that in a PS. It's once you start looking at the relationships going on of the First Sea Lords or the Third Sea Lords and at various points, it's very easy to chart at what point the positions shift. And whilst in terms of operations and those things, yes, the First Sea Lord is still the dominant factor. When you couple all this with the fact that due to all this, the Third Sea Lord needs to be irregularly in contact with the Treasury, the various House of Commons committees, the various House of Lords committees, the various ranking members of Parliament for both parties and all these things, to explain procurement, to explain what's going on in dockyards, to explain the research funding that needs to be funded for secret research and all those things, you suddenly start to realise very quickly that an able Third Sea Lord is able to run rings around the First Sea Lord, and the more experience they get, the more dangerous they get. Which is why the length of time, 1892 to 7 and 1933 to 9, matters. Both of those are quite long periods in service. Long periods in service. Close to 6 and 7 years. And that means they actually see out some First Sea Lords. And that's an issue, because that means the First Sea Lord comes in and the Third Sea Lord's already well embedded. They've already been in there long enough that they already know the situation. They were already causing trouble for your predecessor, probably. And now you've come in and you're the new person on the block. And yes, you might have had experience. You might have been a former Third Sea Lord, but what is your relations with the current Third Sea Lord? What's your power base going to be? How are you going to work with them? Are you going to make them an ally, or are you going to make them a foe? Sensible First Sea Lords make them an ally. And I would also point out that, historically speaking, when the Royal Navy lost the Third Sea Lord, it's from that point onwards it has had, and the control and position it has had more and more trouble in terms of procurement. And the recent efforts to basically reconstitute the Third Sea Lord, the work that's been going on in the Royal Navy, has borne fruit in that things are starting to get slightly better and slightly more organised, because there is now someone whose job it is to basically be the naval officer, A, looking into the future and deciding what you need to procure, and B, the person who's going around explaining, at least to the political classes, what and why it needs to be done, and coordinating those efforts. So let's consider Fisher as Third Sea Lord. What was he about? Well, he was about destroyers. He was about a faster battle line. This was him beginning to exercise his thesis of speed is armor. And the thing is, if you look at it in the context of the 1890s, early 1900s, you can see some legitimacy for it. But the thing is, think of it this way. If your average speed is 16 knots and I can do 20 knots, then I can go 25% faster than you for 4 extra knots. That's an advantage. But if your speed is 28 knots and mine is 32, then my 4 knot advantage is merely a seventh. It's a seventh. Which, let's be honest, is a 13% speed advantage. And does it really help me? It's kind of like the whole saying of if you were on the motorway and you are doing, if you're doing 30 in a 20 zone, you're going 50% faster. You will cut significant time off your travel. You're also probably, in a nice way, being an idiot, because 20 zones are mostly near school children and those things, and realistically there are also going to be speed bumps, which, if you discount the thing of breaking the law, the speed bumps in this country are usually high enough. They're going to break your suspension. So going over 20 speed bumps at 30 is going to be a good way to damage your vehicle. But if you're doing, let's say, 80 in a 70 on the motorway, what does that extra 10 miles an hour really get you? For its cost, if you get caught and you get into trouble, what does it get you? There's no advantage. There's no real advantage. There's no point. And it's the same with naval forces and naval warfare. At above a certain point, the speed advantage doesn't really work out as an advantage. And this is a time period when there's a lot of technology coming in. There's a lot of engines being developed, turbines are starting to come in, all sorts of things, and all sorts of units are starting to appear. Now, Fisher was heavily involved in the development of torpedo boat destroyers, the Daring class and various vessels like that. And he's going to be pushing for that. So he did push for that. I would say also Fisher is more prepared to balance as Third Sea Lord than he is as First Sea Lord. As Third Sea Lord, he's more prepared to balance the traditional with the new and have both. I would say the thing you find with Fisher as Third Sea Lord, this is an interesting thing about a Third Sea Lord, okay. When you're First Sea Lord, you know your time is limited. You know you are going to leave the service. You know you are on borrowed time, realistically, and you're thinking about legacy. When you're Third Sea Lord, you could well have you're probably going to have many more years. Let's be honest, quite a lot of Third Sea Lords end up going off to become various Commander-in-Chiefs on station, and then coming back to become a First Sea Lords or Second Sea Lords. They go up in the service still. So you're not so thinking about your legacy. You're not thinking in terms of absolute. You're not under the pressure of time. So you're more prepared to accept compromise, to expect, how do I put this, be sensible. And that's really the interesting thing. But still, he does build the Renown, which is probably the prettiest pre-dreadnought ever built. I really do think the Renown is pretty. But he makes a great deal of sacrifices to get what he considered the necessary speed. Which, if we consider that she was capable of 19 knots. 19 knots. And to get that, she had 2 twin 10-inch guns, so 4 10-inch guns, and all these things mounted for, aft and sort of forward and aft, twinning at each end, and a lot of 10 single 6-inch guns, and she only has up to 8 inches of armor and all these things. And you wait like a year. She's launched in 1895. She's roughly contemporaneous with the Majestics class. And they're 16-knot ships. They are. They're 16-knot ships. But they have 4 12-inch guns. And they have a 9-inch belt. Okay, so she has a 3-knot advantage over them. However, next class after them, which are the Canopus class, which are launched in 1897, so roughly 2 years after she's launched, Canopus is launched. 2 years. And their speed is 18 knots. They're armed with those 4 12-inch guns again. They have 12 6-inch guns, 10 12-pounder, that's 76mm or 3-inch guns, 6 3-pounder guns, 4 18-inch torpedo tubes, and yeah, they're pretty much looking at the toughness. But again, to get that speed, to get those extra 2 knots, they've dropped their belt down to 6 inches. And then, of course, they're succeeded by the Formidables, which managed to keep the speed, but the belt goes up to 9 inches, and they are... well, they're launched in 1898. So, basically, her speed buys her, 2 years of advantage before she starts to get into trouble? 2 years of advantage if she's lucky? And it just gets worse. And that's the problem with trading speed for armor and firepower. Is that as engines get more powerful and denser, you get to be able to generate more power for the same amount of space. Or even less space. You start to get into a trouble. You can't keep chasing that increased speed. But as I said, it makes a certain sense in the period he's coming from. His other idea is he wants a lot of firepower forward. That's always his dream. It starts. He's already nursing in this period, but he's been studying the battle. He's been studying all these battles that have taken place, and he's thinking about how to best employ that information. The idea that comes out of that you need 6 guns, preferably firing forward, to be able to do ranging shots. Now, for a certain amount of time, you're only going to be doing ranging shots. You're going to only able to really hit things with your 6-inch guns, so you don't worry. The big guns are about status. They're not about actual killing power. If they do, they will deliver their final coup de grace, but they won't do the most of the damage. They'll be down to 6-inch guns firing rapidly as possible. But as times change, as the realities of long-range coordinated fire start to change, that view, of course, changes as well. And then we have Admiral Henderson. Please note, I want you to be sure about this. This is not an aircraft carrier. It is a forward aviation support ship. Now, I have
read during my PhD when did a lot of my PhD thesis focuses on Henderson and what he did with the naval aviation in Britain. And a lot of people do point out that, he insisted on it being a full-length flight deck, etc., and it was supposed to have structures on it, but those structures disappear rather quickly and all sorts of things. What people miss is that he does a lot of work to get this through in a way that it pays just enough attention to the rules that it glides through, but not so much it cannot do its role. And he calls it HMS Unicorn. Because again, the Ship Naming Committee, you look at which Sea Lord they realistically answer to in this period, it's the 3rd Sea Lord. Pretty much anything interesting in the Royal Navy in this period, if you look at who they answer to on the board level, it's the 3rd Sea Lord. It's just amazing. Now, Henderson had been the first Rear Admiral aircraft carrier since World War I. He had managed to start to rewrite British carrier doctrine and comes up with a lot of the ideas about multi-carrier operations and how they should work together, and its air defence doctrine, etc., and his staff worked that through. He then goes on to become 3rd Sea Lord, and he's key in making and trying to compromise and get the best he can for the carriers, but also make the case for naval aviation to return to the Royal Navy and under full control of the Royal Navy, because he's fed up with fighting the battles of the Air Ministry, not the Royal Air Force. In fact, he's one of the first people which really did push me in that direction, because there was traditionally there's always this view of it's RAF versus the Navy, and it comes out and you get so many people on both sides going, yeah, it was the Navy or it was the RAF, and instead I go, no, it wasn't. Most of the fighting actually takes place with the Air Ministry, and they're fighting a large chunk of the RAF as well at the time, because the Air Ministry gets captured by one of the factions within the Royal Air Force. And it's just a nightmare for everyone. And that's what can happen to any, the Admiralty at times gets captured by a faction with the Navy. The Royal Navy's factions tend to be slightly weird, though. They don't tend to be type specific. They tend to be concept of operations specific, but we'll leave that to one side. And the same thing happens to the Army, but the Army usually finds that Horse Guards gets captured by the Guards. In the nicest way, the British Army usually finds that, that it gets captured by the Guards, and then they need to bring in an engineer or an artillery officer to fix things. You can always tell when that happens with the British Army in its history. See, it will have guard officer, then engineer brought in, who will suddenly bring in a whole load of reforms. And then they'll go, yes, we now need to go back to a gentleman with a decent title. Okay, for a time and title, and then it'll be engineer or artillery officer. People who have to pass actual qualifications to be their officers. And it happens. It happens. But Henderson is a very, very canny operator, because it's not just carriers he works on aviation. He also works on getting cruisers through. You're talking the Town class, you're talking the Didos, you're talking Driver class destroyers, you're talking quite a lot of the Royal Navy's destroyer program, a wider destroyer program, their submarine program, the Hunt class escort destroyers, the Flower class corvette program, the submarine programs. He pushes through things like the U class and their, approach to underwater hydrodynamics. All these things are things he pushes through. If you go and look into the history of the Royal Navy and you look at what comes out of those periods, it's one of the most productive periods of the naval constructors and the dockyards and the scientific research works in the Royal Navy's history. And it's down to a lot of hard work by this man. In fact, there are many people, myself included, who would describe it as he works himself to death to make sure Britain's prepared for World War II. Remember, he gets made 3rd Sea Lord in 1933. That's a year after the 10-year rule has officially ended. It's 4 years before it actually ended. Because it's theoretically ended in 1932, but as we all know, the Treasury doesn't actually relax the very tight spending controls till about 1937. And he has to fight to maintain it, to keep civilian shipyards open, because there's a branch of the Treasury going around paying them to close and write covenants into them that they can never be reopened as a shipyard. And he has to prepare the Navy for war. And he pulls a lot of late nights, a lot of full days, and he spends weekends touring shipyards. He does all sorts of things. He pushes himself to the absolute limit. He really does. And his family support him in it. His family do their best to keep him going and help him, and make it as viable as they possibly can for him. He's really, really cool. But he ends up dying. Which is kind of sad, for 2 reasons. One, he would probably been posted quite an interesting place, because he's a very experienced and very reliable officer who's done all sorts of fun things in World War One and in interwar years, as well as being Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. And you sort of go, well, he's one of those senior officers who the Royal Navy loses at the beginning of World War II or just before World War II, from illness, from working them to death to try and prepare the Navy for World War II, which is what leads to a shortage of senior officers in their ranks. And one of the reasons why you have people like Somerville and Cunningham pretty much work to death as well during the war, because of the fact you have a shortage of these sort of senior officers. One of the really interesting things that does come out of it is, of course, you have the decision for the 14-inch guns on the King George V, which Chatfield pushes through, but he wants the 16-inch guns on the Lions. He'd have been prepared to set 9 15-inch guns, but... And this is where one of the more consistent myths comes out about the Lions, though, which is I find most interesting from him, is the amount of people who go, oh, the Lions were the Lions, they weren't ready for them, they couldn't be completed. No. What happens is people, as war goes on, they pause them, and then they keep having ideas for how they could improve them. And they keep changing designs around. And eventually it becomes kind of like the Admiral class, the last 3 Admirals. You're making so many changes, you want to make so many differences, you're basically designing a whole new ship, in which case it's cheaper and easier to restart. It's cheaper and easier to restart than to carry on with what you've already done and already got. But it is kind of interesting to think of if he hadn't died and World War II hadn't begun when it did. A, he'd have probably gone on to become First Sea Lord, and B, things like the Lion class, etc. would probably have been built, and there's a whole question about the Vanguards, but that was another design study, another design project he had. It was in his backup sort of stockpile. It's one of the interesting things. He is the 3rd Sea Lord who carries on for a couple of them. Jellicoe was similar in that he has design studies upon design studies for contingencies upon contingencies upon contingencies. It's almost as if he realizes in wartime you don't have time to do a lot of thorough design work. So you need to do as much of design work as you can in peacetime, so you can pull the design study out and modify a design study design and get with it quickly, rather than have to design from scratch. And so much of the Royal Navy Model 2 comes from, oh, this was a design study from 34, from 35, from 36, and we've adapted in this way. And you can tell when you read them, and then some people go, these designs, they just appear magically in Model 2. They don't. They didn't appear magically. They had been commissioned and been run time and time again. Some of the design studies are run 3 or 4 times. It's really interesting. One of the interesting things is the carrier design studies. There are a lot of carrier design studies done. A few of them produce aircraft carriers. A lot of them are just studies working on it. And one of the consistent things that turns up in those studies is there usually is a 27,000-ton dream carrier, which has armour, the strike-sized air group, the armour of the fleet carrier, the air group of the strike carrier, and all the protection and subdivision they actually would wish to put in them, and then depending on what they're orientated and designed for, they make sacrifices, they make compromises. And this reality comes back to the power of the Third Sea Lord, because you have to remember the Third Sea Lord. What the Third Sea Lord does is let's say the First Sea Lord and the Admiral of the Sea goes, we have this, we would like a new class of battleship. Okay? The Third Sea Lord will go away and prepare the designs and the options for them. We'll take them in, the 3 options. 1 will be obviously wrong, 2 will be practically the same. Trust me on this, I've seen enough of these design papers presented to the Admiralty. They pick one of the 2, which are obviously the good ones to pick. I go away, and then it's charged to the Third Sea Lord to run them. And the Third Sea Lord will run the procurement of them, will select the yards that are going to be building that, will oversee the finalised designs. Any changes which have to be made during the design because of changes in technology will just go to the Third Sea Lord. They won't even go up to the Admiralty. However, it can work a completely different way. It can be the Third Sea Lord comes to the Admiralty with, this is the science and technology reviews, this is what we think we're going to need based on exercise and based on our scientific assessment and our future, basically our future looking, we're going to need these ships in the future. Oh, and here's a design study and here are the options. Select. And then he runs it like we talked about earlier. It's a very, very powerful position if you're prepared to use it as such. And it's the Third Sea Lord's job to get the funding, to get those things through Parliament, to get the House of Lords and all these people, the various committees, to select them and accept them. It's his job to go and explain these things, and that's what he does. That being said, though, we've now reached time for the Shameless Book Plug. Now, this is the point where I normally say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow and all that. That's wonderful. Thank you for doing that. Also, it's when I talk about things like next week I have a talk at King's College London on procuring for peace, how you build ships, how you function in deterrence and conflict management into ship design and into your wider fleet procurement. There have been already people who've asked me, why are you talking just about the Navy, not about the Army and the Air Force? I can give you my opinions on the Army and the Air Force and their role in these scenarios, but realistically, I'm a naval historian. I specialise in the naval side of the paradigm. There are others who are better to talk about that than me. Go and ask the chieftain about how armies can get best involved in conventional deterrence, or Rix's Hangar about aircraft and their involvement in conflict management and deterrence. I'm sure they'll give you some excellent points of view. But yeah, that's coming up. That's going to be fun. We've also got a Historiathon the week after that, and then it's the Christmas season. It's going to be a busy few months, and I'm loving it. Thank you for supporting this channel. Thank you for making it all possible. Thank you for making these Patreon questions and all these things happen. Thank you. You will never know how much it means to me, but it means so much. Thank you. That being said, and it's approaching that time, and I probably fancy going and getting onto a new shirt, so yes, next, after this point, you might see me in a completely different top. So, see you in a second. Now, this is an interesting period because, well, how to put this politely, they haven't really started a naval race yet. They haven't really started. There is edges there. There is stuff the Germans are getting up to. Tirpitz is stirring. The French are being the French. They're in Junocole, etc. And there's all sorts of things going on in the world. So this is the period where, realistically, a Third Sea Lord who has the kind of foreknowledge that Henderson does could really lay down a marker. Charles Parsons is working on Turbina, and Turbina will launch in 1894. There are the Majestics class, laid down in 1893.
So coming in 1892, could he make changes to that? Could they be big changes? The long lead items are probably ordered. But the Canopus class are laid down in 1897, and that's a chunk of time away. You are dealing with a world which is on the cusp of a technological revolution. There are a lot of interesting things coming in. A lot of different pieces of history coming together for us as we look back at it, but also a lot of consequences of actions. This has been the long 19th century. It has been peaceful in comparison to quite a lot of human periods, but it's been the kind of peace that's been caused by constant little wars. And it's coming on a legacy of a very, very large conflict on an 18th century which was full of war, full of destruction. And the thing is, things have moved forward. In many ways they have moved forward. Things have changed and evolved, but they haven't. There are limits and advantages to the Third Sea Lord position. Third Sea Lord can conceive of the weapons of the future, can talk, guide the science, guide the engineering, guide the construction. They have huge range of power in that regard. But they need to persuade people to their tactical doctrine. They need to persuade people to their ideas. And so the challenges in 1892 are quite large. They are. But Henderson would not be without allies. Admiral George Tryon dies historically in 1893. He dies when there are manoeuvres going on between his ships in the Mediterranean. He gives orders and, well, people don't listen to, I would say, the context of the orders over the substance. He's trying to get his officers to think for themselves. Now, historically, he dies in June 1893. Historically. If Henderson, with foreknowledge, has come back to 1892, then, honestly, that's going to be one of the people I would think he would want to look up and maybe change some of the ideas of. Maybe tell him to be very careful before ordering such maneuvers. There's all sorts of ways you can change that history, but why am I saying this? Well, because for Henderson, being Third Sea Lord is powerful, but he needs to make sure he has a First Sea Lord who's on the same reforming path with him, who's going to be looking at the operational side, which means he would need to find an officer suitable. That's either someone who's already inclined that way, or someone who he can control. Now, Henderson is not the type who's going to start picking public battles. He's not going to start stirring up the press publicly. Most of the time. He's more the quiet briefing guy, if anything, I think, rather than the public statement guy. But he has got a lot to deal with. He's got to bring, if he wants to do any changes, he wants to prove Britain's position in any way, shape or form, he's got to make sure there's funding going to Parsons, going to Brown, going to various people to fund boiler technology, Yarrow as well, fund turbine technology, fund gun development, all sorts of things he's got to do to get things to work. And he hasn't got infinite time. It's kind of an interesting scenario. Putting him back here reverses with the normal rule of being a Third Sea Lord. Being a Third Sea Lord means you aren't usually legacy hunting, because, as I said, your legacy, you're years away from leaving the service. But, and this is the big, glorious, glutamus maximus of this scenario, you might still, in this case, be hunting that legacy because you have a limited time. He doesn't know if he's going to be chucked back forwards. He doesn't know what he's going to be able to bind in. And you remember, this is a man who lost friends in World War One, who all those sorts of things. He's going to want to better prepare the Royal Navy far better for what's coming. The foundations he can lay in these 6 years could put the Royal Navy in a far better position in a couple of decades hence. And that's what he's going to be aiming for. And we often do ask, we do these things of, let's say, what happens if you go back in time? What would you do? Well, there are a few of us who might actually be able to offer some useful information. But the thing is, it's only if you've got someone like Admiral Henderson going back, and it's not that long going back, so he understands the period, he's trained on a lot of technology of the period, he knows the technology of the period, it's not so far removed from it that he can actually move stuff forward. And he has the engineering knowledge, he has the scientific knowledge, he has the information at his disposal because of his natural inclinations whilst in command. He has been a gunnery officer, he has done torpedo training, he has done all these things. He knows what he's doing. He understands engines. One of the things we find out with people writing about him as Third Sea Lord is that he is a very quick study and has studied a lot before he's even come into the role. You have to remember, for his previous 3 years before he becomes Third Sea Lord, he was Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. And during that period, he spends a huge amount of time, a humongous amount of time, working with the then Third Sea Lord to try and better prepare the Navy for naval aviation, to work through the realities of carrier construction, of carrier task group construction, of what they need. That's where some of the early concepts for didos and tribals start out as basically, what do we have to escort carriers because they have to go out of the task group to chase wind. And at a certain point you start to go to the policy of, right then, instead of the carrier chasing the wind, the task group chases the wind and the task group goes with the carrier. But that's an evolution over time. So he's been doing a lot of work. And I think what's really interesting is going to be what he's going to do to ships below capital ship level. I think the two areas he's going to be working on are going to be the capital ships, but I think also it's going to be destroyers. Probably cruisers as well, but honestly for cruisers, the first thing he's probably going to try and push through is some turret design. Because I think he's going to want turreted cruisers. I think he's going to want to get rid of, as quickly as possible, casemate weapons, because he's the guy who served in World War One, and he knows how bad and how unreliable casemates proved in rough weather. If casemates aren't reliable, then you want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. And you can get rid of them in this period. You do have the technology beginning to be around in this period. You just need someone who's willing to push for it. Who's willing to push for it and push hard for it. And so what does this lead to Henderson doing? Well, I can see the Canopus class being something slightly different. Whilst I don't think he probably changes the Majestics that much, and I am not sure if Renown gets built as she historically does. If she does, she's going to be a tester ship for his ideas for the Canopus class. But I could see them ending up with something like this, which has 6 13.5-inch guns in 3 twin turrets, 12 6-inch guns in 6 twin turrets, and, a load of 3-inch casemates. Although this particular design, I decided to play around with and only actually had 8 6-inch guns. But, I could see that happening quite easily. And I could see it also being turbine-powered, because, well, I think he's going to be pushing for destroyers to be turbine-powered. He's not going to, for Henderson, he's not going to need to be persuaded of the arguments of turbine versus triple expansion engines. He is going to come in and he's going to have a lot of solutions available. Now, if you think about it this way, if you're getting the PSI of boilers and turbines being put in in the late 1890s into the Royal Navy of the 1930s into the Royal Navy of the 1890s. That changes the world quite a lot. If he's going for, how do I put this politely, centralized fire control, director-led fire control, again, he's going to be pushing it through. That's something he's used to, he understands, and he's got sort of all ideas. Again, this was someone who understands the battle fleet of Jutland and understands the decisions which come after it and the world which comes after it. He's also going to be going for quality control. Again, this is someone who has read all the reports of Jutland, all the reports after the war, and all the stuff which has been held by the Third Sea Lord's office and their reports about it after the war. So he's going to be obsessed with quality control of armour, quality control of guns, quality control of shells and fuses. You think about all the things that he could and would be able to do. I think you have a Royal Navy which quickly looks closer to the 1920s version of the Royal Navy in terms of its ship design than the 1900s. I think you will quickly find yourself with probably on lines of efficiency. Again, he's, in the nicest way, he's probably going to be able to take a similar line to what, to extent to what Admiral Jackie Fisher took. But he's going to say, look, I can cut ships' crews. Because instead of us having to have 16 casemated 6-inch guns, I can have 8 turreted 6-inch guns, and you still have 8 guns. 8 guns to fire, but that can cover each side. You still have the same broadside strength, so I can halve your gun crews. He's going to be able to present a lot of things which are actual technological advantages and advances as cost-saving measures, and he's going to do it. This is the man who, as said, HMS Unicorn was a forward aviation support ship. There are various other examples I can use. You go through water as armour, etc. That's going around for quite a while, but there's all sorts of little tidbits hidden in various ships and various designs where you sort of go, oh, really? Again, aircraft carriers, but also cruisers, etc., suddenly found that some of their water tanks, their feed water tanks, in wartime could magically be turned into fuel tanks. They could. And whereas, of course, feed water didn't count towards... feed water doesn't count towards your stand displacement, fuel does. Amazing. There are all sorts of little options. In this period, he has no treaties to deal with. And, let's be honest, the politicians aren't exactly much of a threat in this period. The Treasury's nowhere near as powerful as it would become, and there is funding coming through. Is he going to be able to play the game? Yes. Yes, massively. One of the things that might be interesting is that Henderson could actually be a lot healthier after this period because he's not having to wreck himself. He knows he's got years till a likely major war, and if he can make it into a proper warrior moment, he could buy more time. HMS Warrior, it's arguable, managed to buy Britain 20 years of peace. Some would argue 30 years of peace. Achieving another warrior moment could push back major wars to the 1920s. And this is before we get into the thing, of course, this was a Rear Admiral aircraft carrier who's become Third Sea Lord. He understands aircraft design. He knows about aircraft. Admittedly, it's quite difficult to work out the metallurgy. There aren't already the things in place to really push forward aircraft and aircraft engines. But there are ideas, there are options out there. There are options. And he is a very good student of history, someone who studies a lot of information going on. Imagine what someone with that skill could do to get the right technology taking place in Britain rather than anywhere else in the world. It's a really interesting scenario to put someone like this back down. I think the biggest change will probably be the direct fire control. I think if he produces a ship which is 21 to 24 knots, as this one's 24 knots, my design. That's why I reduced the 6-inch guns numbers. I reduced them down, put the weight into engines. It has a 10-inch belt, not massive by any stretch of imagination, but 10-inch belt of crop armor. Everyone else in this period will be on Harvey armor, and just went, well, let's see what I can do, test around us. So let's see what it might be like. It can tootle around and bash up everything. It really can. I went with 13.5-inch guns, but he could go 14-inch guns. There are options out there. There are weapon systems out there, and he's going to know the value of having big guns. Having guns which are big enough that everyone's going to look at you and go, excuse me? And having guns like this, that gives him ability to do super firing, and that's, again, something which is going to be perfectly normal to him. One of the interesting things is we're taking basically someone who's at the end of the big gun battleship period. He sort of is towards end, and use the technologies of it at its end, to the beginning of it. The amount of tech he can bring back and implement will be massive. There's even the whole people developing, as I've talked about before, Marconi, etc. experiments which are producing early forms of radar, the early understanding of radar, which historically don't get any funding or any research until, we're talking World War I, about 20 years later. But in this period, well, as I've said before, and I'll emphasize again, Henderson is in charge of the Royal Navy Scientific Service as head of the Third Sea Lord. He's in charge of the director of the Department of Engineering, or rather the Steam Department, as it's called at various points, and Naval Ordnance, the explosives people. Think about that. You have literally taken someone with that knowledge who's used to running these, who did have understanding of running these departments, who'd been trained for it, put him into an earlier version with all his foreknowledge, and are letting him go. That's scary. That is scary. I mean, you can do this with other navies if they're taking back their knowledge with them. That is very, very scary. And his knowledge is his life. If you go, okay, no, he can't have any of his knowledge to go back with, well, then he wouldn't have his life, because he had lived through this. He had lived through this. Admiral Reginald Guy Henderson was born on the 1st of September 1881. In simple terms, he actually entered the Royal Navy as a naval cadet in 1895. So he would have been Third Sea Lord at the same time he's entering, overlapping him entering as a cadet. So, would this be better, worse, about the same? Well, I think it would be better. I think it would be, you wouldn't have some of the robustness politically that Fisher brings to it in terms of the robust, public, rambunctious political approach. I don't think you'd have that. But you'd have someone in power in the Royal Navy who had a fundamental understanding of where they were going, of what was coming and where they were. And that is interesting. Someone who literally historically took part in the Battle of Jutland, so really knows where things are coming from, has had all sorts of experiences in the Royal Navy historically in prior to World War One, during World War One, 20s and 30s. But in this case, now he's back as a third Sea Lord at what was historically the beginning of his career, able to influence things, able to evolve things, able to manufacture a warrior moment. I do think he would manufacture a warrior moment. And I think that could be really scary. Now, I've gone very, very simple. I've gone for about 15,000 tons, 6 13.5-inch guns, 24 knots, turbine power, all the basic stuff I could do. I did it as simple as I could in various testing systems. I have to admit the graphics I've chosen are from Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, but that's because every time I use the ones from the other software I use, occasionally Spring Sharp, for some reason YouTube tries to tell me that I am copyright striked. And I've now had it every time I've put it up there, it tries to tell me this video is copyright, is held back from copyright. I have no idea why. I stick the images in like I do with UAD. But this is why I use the UAD images. And yeah, it produces a very interesting potential. Again, I've gone for 13.5-inch guns. I could have gone for 14-inch or even bigger potentially. You know, there is the 16.25-inch going around, and knowing Henderson, he might well try and push for a 16.5-inch gun. He does seem to always come back to the 16.5-inch gun as a beloved weapon. But yeah, this is what you could see. Also go with twin turrets. Now remember, Henderson will know all about how to make about triple turrets, the nail rods, and making those work. And there is a possibility there are yard spaces which could build bigger ships than this. That would require funding. But it'll be interesting to see what he could achieve. What he could achieve and what he could get. I think the biggest long-term impacts will actually be the quality control he'll push through. And if he can get a first Sea Lord like Tyrion, someone who's going to be as reforming as he is, by hook or by crook, then the Royal Navy will be well on the way to getting out the problems it has in the 19th century. Now, people are going to point out Victorian Navy here and the issues with that. The thing is, Henderson, how do I put this, in many ways can probably deal with that better than Fisher. You see, Fisher gets into a competition with quite a few people over ego, over who gets credit for these things, over who's got the status. Henderson doesn't care about that. And that's what makes him such a scary political operator. He doesn't give a flying hoot who gets the credit. I've had this debate with a few times with people because they've gone, well, you know, he gets written out of their autobiographies or minimized, and they almost pretend that they did everything that he did. And I go, he wouldn't have cared about that at all. What mattered to him was the Navy. What mattered to him was that the people were safe, the country was safe, and they were able to do their job as safely as he could make it possible for them to do their job, and as effectively as he can make it possible for them to do their job. He doesn't care about credit. That's not his style. So in this period, that's going to make him lethal. Everyone else is going to want credit. Henderson doesn't care. If all he has to do to get something done which is going to make the Navy more effective is give someone else the public credit. Hooray! He'll throw them a bloomin' party. He'll give them a stage. He'll build them one in a dockyard himself, if that's all he needs to do to get what he wants done. Because for him, his experience from World War I is that there are far worse things to lose than credit. Far worse things to lose than credit. So I think there will be a lot of changes. But the Royal Navy you'll be dealing with in this period, in World War I and all these things, it'll be a very different Navy. And the question becomes, does the history work out the same way? That's the really interesting scenario, because if Britain has let forward as far as it could do in this period, and has built things in place which are going to keep it moving, maybe at a more historically traditional pace, but still after having had that great earlier leap forward, that could put a massive spanner in the works for various alliances and analysis of the situation. It could really mean that Britain is looking at everyone going, oh, good. Oh, that's nice. Oh, aren't your battleships nice? They're all capable of doing 18 knots. Oh, goody. They're all nice. Or maybe they catch up. But also there is a real chance that this turns everything into a qualitative race, and means that maybe quantitative race, that, the Anglo-German naval race, doesn't really happen, because if you're already stuck in a qualitative race, and in case of Germany, they could either do the qualitative race or the quantitative race. They couldn't do both. The Navy didn't have the budget. To try and get into that budget, they'd have to raid the Army's budget, and they're always going to lose that argument. Well, that changes if Germany's sucked into a qualitative race as well. If everyone's sucked into a qualitative race instead of a quantitative race, then, well, it could change the context of a lot of things. And that's going to be the question, really, I want you all to think about, is what happened from this section. There's going to be another question from the Fisher section a bit, but from this section, the question is, what happens if Henderson does all this and it starts off a qualitative race, and so Tirpitz, instead of being able to do the Navy laws like he did, where it was going to be a quantitative race, it was going to be a numbers game, was forced down the quality game. And so it was a case of, oh, our battleship's better than yours because it's got this stat, and our battleship's better than yours because it's got this stat. Does that change the context of Anglo-German relations enough that maybe Britain doesn't join the Entente? That the relationship stays as even as it does with America and Italy and Japan, which are also part of the qualitative race? Does it mean France can actually get involved in the qualitative race, or gets involved? It's an interesting thing to think about. But now, Fisher. Now, for Fisher, there's the problem: he's coming forward in time, and technology, which was a theory when he was Third Sea Lord, is now old hat. However, Fisher always had a slightly different style. What's interesting is he's going to find himself with the treaty system, which are shackles he's going to hate. An economic situation where the treaty system means that he can't play the best political moves he has in his arsenal. An air ministry, which is as much of a problem to him as a treasury, both of which he didn't have to deal with so much when he was Third Sea Lord. Well, the air ministry didn't exist then. And a technological transition where a whole new form of artillery is coming into service. Because let's be honest, aircraft, and I know this is heresy to some, but let's be honest, aircraft realistically are just another form of artillery. Okay? It might be a bomb they're dropping, but that could also be a shell. it's another form of artillery. When you're looking at it from a naval officer's perspective in terms of fleet battles, instead of you engaging at the maximum range of your guns, you're engaging at the maximum range of your aircraft. And instead of dropping shells, you're dropping bombs. Okay? It's another form of artillery. And this is a man for whom speed is life. Now, that doesn't apply in ships because there is a pragmatic limit. But in aircraft, pre-missiles, speed is life. The horsepower wars will begin again anew. But first of all, to really do that, he needs to get control of the fleet air arm off the Air Ministry. Now, Henderson worked quietly. He was a quiet political style. He did deals in back rooms. He did ideas. He did, how do I put this politely? Subtlety. Fisher is about as subtle as a bull in a china shop when he wants to be. Fisher will not thread the needle. Fisher will smash the needle. So these challenges are going to be confronted head on. Add to that, the submarine threat and menace which he saw coming has come to pass. The destroyer has evolved beyond all sorts of things, and he's got all these ships. Even worse than all of this, though, he's got to deal with politicians who are used to using politics to decide his naval policy. It will be bloody. It will be an absolute nightmare. There are lots of challenges to be faced. There are lots of realities. In many ways, you've taken someone who was in a very challenging political landscape back to a time which is a challenging technological transition because it's a lot of new things coming online, and someone from a rather less challenging political landscape, let's be honest, into an incredibly challenging political landscape with a technological time where a lot of stuff is maturing rather than burgeoning. Fisher is not going to have a moments of peace, but he is an incredibly active, incredibly healthy individual. And again, we're talking about third Sea Lord Fisher. Not later first Sea Lord Fisher, third Sea Lord Fisher. He usually, in that time period, whilst he has concepts, he relies on others for engineering. He relies on the likes of Stanley Goodall and the other constructors to do the actual engineering for him. In this period is what he'd do. In the earlier period, he relies on the gentleman of that period. But that's what he's going to do. He's going to have to work through people like Stanley Goodall, work through the various engineers. He is far less engineeringly savvy than Henderson. Far less inclined to that one. But that's useful. And before someone starts sort of going, well, no. Fisher did this. You have to remember, and he was honest in admitting this, he arranged the Dreadnought class with wing turrets because he didn't believe superfiring was possible, technologically. The moment he found it out he was really about as bashful about it as he ever gets. Why? Because realistically, even though you are going to be a slightly broader beam to deal with the extra height of superfiring, you would be a far narrower beam than you are with the wing turrets. And that means you can probably drop a turret that amount of weight, drop the beam, and reduce it. And if you've got the same engine, same length, but a narrower beam, your length to beam ratio goes up, and probably your speed does as well. And again, he's a speed is life guy. But he's going to have an interesting time adjusting. Now, again, though, because of the situation, Henderson realistically took about a year to 18 months to get his feet on the table and manage to start pushing ahead. The difference is this time is it's not going to be the politics which he's assessing. It's going to be... politics is what Henderson was assessing. Fisher's going to be assessing the technology. It's going to be interesting. It'll be very interesting. With that being said, though, what would Fisher do? Well, I don't think with roughly 3 years that the treaty system is going to survive. I do not see Second London Naval Treaty happening. Because if he's in power, if he's not got rid of, and it's very difficult for people like Third Sea Lords to be dismissed by the government. They can try, but it's very difficult to get rid of them in this time period. Someone like Fisher, who's as naturally loud as Fisher is, capable of using the turns of phrase he does. Just imagine him walking up to the paper, which, let's be honest, the first Prime Minister starts off it's Ramsay MacDonald, he's Labour Party Prime Minister. Imagine if Fisher walked up to a senior member of the union movement, one who had the ear of the press, and told them, well, it's because of the treaties all these people are getting sacked. We need new ships. We're desperately short of ships. We're in a national peril for new ships, but we can't order them because of the treaties. The government would love to, but, they feel they have to because they feel it's the consensus. We don't want war. We want to deter conflict. But, we can't do this. Now have that conversation play out 50, 60 times. Henderson is the one who has quiet conversations with MPs and ministers and lords and occasionally the odd newspaper baron, but rarely. Fisher is the type who goes around and has loud conversations with loud people. He's the kind of guy who works through someone like Winston Churchill. So yeah, there is going to be loudness. There is going to be a lot of interesting things done. And the thing is, the Second London Naval Treaty comes in and that puts in the 14-inch gun limit on battleships. And realistically, Henderson wanted backup options. He didn't get them. To accept to not get them is one of the reasons why he gets the free hand he does in later orders, as I've discussed before. But if you can get rid of the Second London Naval Treaty, if you can get rid of that treaty limit, and I mean this in the nicest way, you have to remember, Second London Naval Treaty already was a individual limiting treaty, not a cumulative limiting treaty. The cumulative limits were gotten rid of. So realistically, that's close to you might get an earlier renegotiation. That might be the way Fisher works. It might be, oh yeah, this is the limitation we want, and it's got to be reworked. But the thing is, I can't see him tolerating the individual limits on ships either. I really can't. He's going to want to work with freedom, with impunity. And then you've got the whole design methodology that the British do. You know, can you imagine Admiral Fisher, the man who has conceptions of things like incomparable, being told, oh yeah, there's the 27,000 ton design. We can't build that because we can't get enough of them. So we have to build something which is less than that. It wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. And he's got to get aviation under control. And I think Air Ministry is going to be an interesting one. I think possibly he does something really underhand in that one. You see, the Air Ministry, to an extent, wanted to keep the Fleet Air under control so they didn't have to compete with them for funding and for manufacturers. And you can understand that. There are also factions who believed it was honestly better because if it was under the control of the Air Ministry, then the people who understood air power would be directly involved, and I can understand that perspective. I can. The reality was that the Air Ministry was captured by Bomber Command. It was captured by the Bomber Mafia. And for all the good points of them, and they were patriots, I despise it when people go, well, no, these people don't love their countries. No, they do. They all love. It's just they fundamentally believe that what they think is the right way, and they will not listen to anyone else. And that's a bad way to be. It is a bad way to be in any circumstance. Unwilling to listen to any other point of view, any other perspective, it never puts you in a good position. You might not agree with it, but you should still listen to it. And argue with it. Not completely chuck it away, because then you can't learn. You can't learn to sharpen your own beliefs, and you can't learn what others might understand that you're missing. But I could see Fisher again manipulating that. Look at how he fights the army in this period as First Sealer. Look at how he fights the various people trying to go after Navy spending after going after his battleship designs. He brutalizes them. Look at how he deals with internal problems in the Navy. People who disagree with him internally in the Royal Navy. He absolutely destroys them. He goes for the jugular every single time. So what happens? I think if you get a little bit on battleships, if you do get a Second London Naval Treaty, and I'm very tempted to say you don't get any form of Second London Naval Treaty, it will have no cumulative limits, and honestly the limits of the ship sizes and the guns will go up. Or rather, there'll be... How do I put this politely? How would I... I think if Fisher's going to accept them, he would accept it only with an escalated clause which is sufficiently weak that someone just needs to look the wrong way and it's justified. At a piece of paper. Look the wrong way at a design and it's justified for you to build something bigger and better. And the King George V come out looking something closer to the Lions, and Ark Royal and the Illustrious class come out looking something closer to the Implackables. I.e., the Ark Royal, the 27,000 ton variant of the Ark Royal design had armour, had all the torpedo defences, had everything, as well as the air group. And, pretty much the Illustrious class. The Illustrious class, if you go into the design study which produces the Illustrious class, you look at the 27,000 ton variant, it looks incredibly similar, spec-wise and shape-wise and everything, to the Implackables. I know that's indefatigable up there, but to the Implackables. Incredibly similar. There are a few things moved in terms of the subdivision designs, but that's the kind of stuff which happens in final design from a design study. It really is. Things move a bit here, a bit there, as they're perfecting it, let's say. And that's realistically the way he's going to go. There's also quite strong possibility that he does everything he can to accelerate the building. Now, how's he going to manage that? Well, historically, of course, he's going to be looking at ships and going, shall we cut old ships? He hasn't got the ships to cut because of the treaty system. I wouldn't be surprised also if he finds a way to get sloops ordered. Probably again by manipulating the various empire and dominion governments and administrations. Get them to build sloops. But get them to build corvettes. Get them to build whatever he can get them to build in their local yards. Probably call it the Imperial Police design or something like that. Something that's going to draw everyone together and get them all to build something. Again, he tried this before. He has succeeded in this. Let's be honest, when he was Third Sea Lord and First Sea Lord in his time zone, he managed to get the minions to sign up to all sorts of things. Usually by using their own press against them. Shamelessly. He shamelessly used their press against them. And how do you do this? Well, you talk to the press. Here's the thing about media as a whole, is media doesn't like a vacuum. And when someone doesn't give an answer and there isn't another compelling story, they will write about the vacuum. So if you can spin them a narrative which is a compelling narrative, which has enough basis in truth and reality that it is substantiated and that they can feel like they are saving their people, that they are standing up for good, for the right, for the the underdogs, like most humans in that situation, they will leap at it because everyone is the human of their own. Every human is the hero of their own story. Every human is the hero of their own story. And a chance to be heroic is what everyone dreams of. And that's how Fisher uses the press. When you look at the articles which are written, you can almost always tell the people he's been talking to, because they come across as if they're fighting for it, as if they are crusading on behalf of it, on behalf of the nation, on behalf of the empire, on behalf of their people, to protect them. That they are St. George, and the dragon is all the accountants and all the merciless people who are preventing you from investing in it. It's almost scary thinking about this. Now, when you start talking about this, though, you have to remember there are going to be politicians who are going to be gunning for it, and traditionally Henderson gets his position extended. Would Fisher, again, Fisher historically got his position as Third Sea Lord extended. He did a double term. I think Fisher probably would achieve that this time, because, again, there's going to be a problem. There are two ways to have job security. One, you're indispensable, so no one can get rid of you. Because if you do, the place falls down, and they know it. Two, and this only happens in a political scenario, you create such a problem that having you on the outside is viewed as a lot worse as having you on the inside. Because inside they realise you're shackled and limited in some ways. If you're on the outside, you're completely off the chain. They have no way of controlling you. And you do that by occasionally appearing to offer concessions which they can only force out of you because you're on the inside. And that makes them very scared to get rid of you. Fisher was a master of the second form. Henderson did the first one. Fisher did the second. It's two modus operandis. So Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin will probably develop a nervous tick. Every time they hear the word fish, I don't think either of them will be able to eat fish ever, because the moment they hear the word fish, they'll just go, where is he? Where is he? He's not here, is he? No, yeah, not again. It'll be traumatic for them. But again, it'd be rather interesting chucking an Admiral Fisher into 1933 to 1939 with the diplomacy and development. The other thing is, of course, it's going to impact is the submarines. It's going to be a massive impact on the submarines. Because Fisher loved them and destroyers. So they're all going to get a whole amount of investment. Will it be better, worse, or about the same? Okay. So within the parameters of the time, Henderson was probably better. However, Fisher is going to break the parameters. Fisher is the type of person to break the parameters. That means it will either be worse, because he'll break them in a way of, we're going down the battleship, battlecruiser route, or he'll latch onto the aircraft carriers, aviation, and the destroyers, and the torpedo, and the submarines, and he'll go down that route, and it'll be better. He will still build battleships no matter what happens. He will still build aircraft carriers no matter what happens. But in one scenario, one becomes the primary, and the other one is, to an extent, the secondary asset. It's cruisers. Like he treated cruisers when he was first Sea Lord. Or, you know, in the other, yeah. I think probably because of his speed is life mantra, aircraft win. Aviation wins. And I think he pushes forward with it. I think he pushes for control. And again, this is not the former First Sea Lord, this is not the post-World War I Fisher we're talking about. We're talking about himself during his time as Third Sea Lord, what he's going to do, what he would do in this position. And I honestly think also the treaties were popular for a while in the UK. They were popular as a method of peace, as this sort of thing. But in the 1930s, when there's a shortage of jobs going on and people are losing employment, and there was already an undercurrent of, we used to build ships to sort this out. We used to build ships. We didn't give people employment benefits. We gave unemployment benefits. We built ships. Henderson plays on that a little bit, and let's be honest, that's the Town class cruisers. That's literally the Town class cruiser program. Why does he get so many cruisers? How does he get them, and the size they are, etc., and built in the yards they are? He literally goes and selects the cities which are most impacted by various things, by the economic circumstances going on, and B, he literally argues for them as an employment measure. That's how he gets as many of the Town class as he does. Well, I could see Fisher turning that up to a maximum. You see, Henderson will do that in the quiet way. Fisher will do that publicly in the press. Fisher will do that in ways which are going to trap ministers, trap governments into doing it. They don't like it. They don't like it when people do this to them. They really don't. But as said, if you do it well enough, they prefer to keep you on the inside than let you on the outside, because then you become too much of a problem. And the question with Fisher is this: how do you think the rest of the world reacts to what he's doing? Because, as I said, I do not see the Royal Navy ending up with a King George V class. They might end up with something in 9 15-inch guns, 15-inch 50s, because then I would see if he goes for a carrier primacy, it'll be 9 15-inch 50s, and he'll be modernising as many of the 15-inch gunships as he can. Possibly even convert the nail rods to 15-inch 50s. Or 15-inch 45s. That was the latest. The one they were developing in the late 1930s was a 15-inch 45, so maybe he goes for 15-inch 45s. Which were going to be lighter than the 15-inch 42, so it's a very easy upgrade, and you can even probably get some extra angle out of them in the turrets. But if he's battleships primary, you'll be lucky if they're coming in at 16-inch gun battleships, or at least, well, the first generation probably are. The moment the treaty's broken, I'm sorry, that they don't have 16-inch guns anymore. They have bigger, whatever bigger he's managed to get available. And again, how would he getting aircraft? If he gets the aircraft back under control, instead of going the quiet way, if he does the gamble in the loud way and manages to get Fleet Air Arm under control a couple of years earlier, instead of the 1937 Inskip Award, maybe it's the 1935 or 34. He's going to pour all the money into developing the engines. He is going to pour so much money into developing engines, because speed is life, and the faster, the longer range his strike aircraft can be. And I think myself, he'll be obsessed with a torpedo bomber, kind of like historically pretty much everyone was. But I think he'll want them to be fast and able to react. The question is for today is, what do you think? How do you think the world will react to Fisher's starless third Sea Lord in the 1920s and in 1930s? What do you think the rest of the world will do in response? That being said, what do we have coming up? Well, when this video's gone out, we're going to have Andrew Cunningham, Master of Confusion, come up, which I'm actually recording some point today. I'm recording today or tomorrow. One of those. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. And if you like the video, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. I still can't believe how many subscribers I have. When this video does actually go out, it's technically the 6th anniversary of the channel. And by 6th anniversary, I mean 6 years since I first uploaded anything, when I was first looking at videos and notes. It was me doing a Battle of the River Plate thing, I think it was something to do with. I forget, it was one of the anniversaries of the Battle of the River Plate, me working on that, and that was the first time I played around with YouTube. And I think those videos, they might be shorts. I'm not sure what they are, where they are. They're very few, small videos, but they've had like 0 views, I think, or something like that. They're very, very low down the view thing for that long ago. But thank you. It's a strange thing to think that I've had over 1 million watch hours on this channel, that I've had over 17,000 subscribers. This year's target is 20,000, but we'll see. Yeah, I've got about 7 weeks to get an extra 2,500 subscribers. I doubt that'll happen, but you never know, luck. And about 3.4 million views, and that's all thanks to you. That's all thanks to your kindness and your support. So thank you for making it all possible. Hope you enjoyed this video. Take care.